and that was Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Really, I can't say prisoner right now, and that's Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Prisoner, try that again. Hey guys, it's Garcia, and today I'm gonna be doing my April reading wrap up. It's been several weeks since April. I'm not gonna go super in depth with everything, so this is gonna be a shorter wrap up than I typically do. As always, I'm gonna start out with my reading stats for the month. So in the month of April, I ended up reading 16 books, which is about 20% less than what I typically do, but it's a lot more than what's gonna be on my May wrap up coming up, so I'm pretty okay with that. As far as categories, I ended up reading 6 fantasy books, 2 sci-fi books, 2 romance books, 1 classic, 2 nonfiction, 2 literary fiction, and 1 horror. For star rating, I had an average star rating of 4.3 stars, which is pretty good for me. I had 3 5-star books, 1 4 3/4 stars, 3 4.5 stars, 4 4 1/4 stars, 3 4-star books, 1 3 1/4 star books, and 1 3.5 star book. By source, 8 of the books were books that I owned, 6 were borrowed from the library, 1 I got from Scribd, and 1 I got from NetGalley. As for medium, 5 of them were hardcover books, 3 were paperbacks, 1 was an ebook, and 7 were audiobooks. For page count, I put a little chart up on the screen for you guys so you can check that out. My average page count ended up being 422 pages, which is about typical for me. I'm usually on the low 400 end, so it actually worked out more than I thought it would be because I read a lot of like shorter books, but then I also read one like really big book. So I think that kind of like canceled that out. So for author's gender, I ended up reading 7 books by male authors, 8 books by female authors, and 1 book by both a male and a female author. For author's ethnicity, I read 14 books by white authors, 1 by a black author, and 1 by a Hispanic author. And by country, I read 11 books from the US, 3 from the UK, 1 from Mexico, and 1 from Canada. Next, I'll just put a little chart up on the screen here with the publication years. I was kind of all over the place with publication years, which is what I usually go for, so I'm pretty happy with that as well. And lastly, I put a chart on the screen for publisher. I didn't have any trends with publisher either, which is interesting because usually I get a lot from like Tor and Orbit, and they're not even there on the list too much in the month of April. So that's actually kind of interesting. So typically what I would talk about next is my reading challenges, which I absolutely failed with my reading challenges because I didn't even really attempt to do them. So towards the end of the month, I was kind of rushing to meet up these challenges, and then I fell into a reading slump, so they just kind of didn't happen. So I put all of that on hold for now, and then hopefully by the end of May, I can kind of pick up my reading challenges again. But I'm struggling a little bit right now, so I just put my reading challenges on hold. I'm mostly just mood reading right now. So before we get to the fiction books that I read, I'm gonna start with the nonfiction books that I read in April. The first one is Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi. I ended up giving this book 4.5 stars. It was fantastic. It is a letter from the author to his son about what it's like to be a black man in America, and such a moving piece that I absolutely love and highly recommend, especially if you read a lot of nonfiction. This is a must read. I really enjoyed it. And this is an author that I've read, I think 2 books by him now, and both of them have been 4.5 stars for me, and I'm really excited to see more of his works. The other nonfiction that I read this month is Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. This one is both a nonfiction and a reread for me because I read it last year or the year before, one of them, because I just thought it would be a fun book to read, and I decided to reread it this year because I was moving shifts around a lot because I typically worked on the afternoon shift, I moved to the morning shift, and now I'm on the night shift, so that's always fun. So I decided to pick up Why We Sleep for some information on how to get some better sleep despite, you know, being on night shift and all of that. And I do think that it has been extremely helpful for me. This is just a great book, very informative. It also has a really good audiobook, but I decided to get the physical copy of it just because I'm probably going to be referencing it a lot because it has a lot of great sleep science and a lot of great tips on how to get better sleep. and I really enjoy this one as well. I'm just a nerd for sciencey books, in case you were wondering. I also did have one reread for the month of April, and that was Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban by J.K. Rowling. So this is part of my Harry Potter reread, in which I'm reading the illustrated book and annotating the paperback copy, which I don't have on me right this second, but I absolutely love the Harry Potter series. It's one of my favorite of all times, and The Prisoner of Azkaban is my favorite book in the Harry Potter series, so of course I loved it, and I ended up giving it 5 stars because, I mean, I don't want to give away anything, but one of my favorite tropes is in this book, and it just made me love reading so much more after I read this book as opposed to the first 2 books in the series. So I absolutely love this series, and this is the one that made me fall in love with the series in the first place. So now we're gonna move on to all of the fiction books that I read for the first time in the month of April, and as always I'm gonna start with my lowest rated book and work my way up to my highest rated. And the first book that I want to talk to you guys about is Gods of Jade and Shadow by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. And I was really excited for this book because it's an adult fantasy novel that incorporates Mayan mythology, which I love Mayan mythology, but it didn't quite meet my expectations that I was hoping to get out of this book. There was a lot in this book that there is to love, and I really liked where this story went, and I really liked the idea of the story. I think it's a great idea. I just really didn't love the execution of it that much, especially the main character really annoyed me at times, and I don't necessarily think it was the main character herself, but maybe just her portrayal of the main character. I don't know. There was just something about this book that had me off, that I never really got into the characters and into the storyline, and because of that I didn't enjoy it as much as I wanted to. But I do think it is a fantastic book that I understand why a lot of other people like it, but I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. Also, one more thing I would like to mention, it does have a pretty prominent romance in here that I didn't enjoy. Like, for a good portion of it, it's not super prominent. Like, it is subtle enough that I think you could read this book and not care about the romance and still really like it, but I personally wanted to like the romance and never got around to it. So I think that also really disappointed me. So the next book that I'd like to talk about is Cold-Hearted Rake by Kleypas. So this is a historical romance novel. It's the first novel in the Ravenel series. So in this book, after the Earl dies, I think his cousin comes in to take over the estate, and he meets the Earl's young wife and his other female cousins that are also living there. And in this series, the Ravenels are very well known for having tempers, so that causes a lot of problems. Also, I thought it was a fun book. I do think there wasn't a whole lot to it other than the fact that it was a romance, but that's kind of why I read it. I wanted something light and easy to read, and it is light and easy to read. I enjoyed it for what it was, and I ended up giving it 3.75 stars. So the next book that I like to talk about is Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson. So this is a literary fiction, and it's about like 2 friends who find each other later in life after a long time, and they kind of reconnect, but one of them needs help with her stepkids who spontaneously combust. Yeah, this book is about spontaneous human combustion. I do think this book was incredibly gripping from the very beginning, and I could not stop reading it. The problem is there is literally no plot to this book. So like, as soon as it started to get interesting, I felt like it just ended, even though like it was so good to begin with. Like, it had such good setup. It just never had an ending. It never had a payoff, I feel like. So I really enjoyed this book for what it was, but I wanted so much more out of it. So I ended up giving this one 4 stars. So the next book on this list is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amar El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. So this is a sci-fi novella that is following 2 characters that are on different sides of this war, and it's set in a futuristic sort of timeline. I did not know what to expect going into this novel, and I really wish that I had known what to expect. I really expected this book to be like just action-packed time and war and just like loopy stuff going on and crazy things, and kind of wasn't. It was a little bit more character-driven and less plot-driven. While I did enjoy the characters, I wasn't expecting it to feel more like a romance novel than a sci-fi novel. So like, I started to get those vibes from it, which I enjoyed, don't get me wrong. That's not why I picked up this book. So while I did enjoy this book and I think it's fantastic, it wasn't the book that I was expecting when I went into it. So because of that, I only ended up giving it 4 stars. So next, I'd like to talk about the Soldier Sun trilogy by Robin Hobb. So in the month of April, I read the 2nd and 3rd books in the Soldier Sun trilogy, which is Forest Mage and Renegade Magic. So Robin Hobb is obviously one of my favorite authors of all time, and the Soldier Sun trilogy, while I I don't think it is her strongest set of books, I did enjoy this a lot more than I was expecting to. I think Force Mage in particular really shines in its character development and just like how hard Robin Hobb is on her characters, because this book is truly devastating if you love the main character. If you don't care for the main character, then it probably could be very boring because it is very slow moving. It doesn't have almost any action in it. In this book, like every time you think it can't possibly get any worse for this character, it somehow gets worse. And I don't know how she does it, but it was fantastic. And I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars. Then I moved on and read Renegade's Magic. This was mostly because I was feeling nostalgic and I wanted to read something by one of my favorite authors, even though like I probably should have just waited to read this book. I do think it was good. It wasn't as good as the previous two books in the series, and I felt like especially towards the end it dragged a lot. While I did like the ending itself, like the very end, which I think actually redeemed the book a lot in my eyes, there was, I feel like, still something missing towards like the middle of the book that I felt like I just wanted more from it. So I ended up giving that one 4.25 stars. Even so, I loved reading it for every second just because Robin Hobb creates these beautiful magical worlds with these very like realistic characters, and you just kind of feel like you're living in this world with them. So I enjoyed every second that I was reading this series, and I ended up giving Renegade's Magic 4.25 stars. So the next book that I'd like to talk about is Shorefall by Robert Jackson Bennett. So I actually did a full review on this one, so if you guys want to check that out, I will link it up in the cards for you guys. But this one is one that was so excited for because it starts off just like in the middle of the action, and I loved that about it. But I was a little annoyed later on because I started to realize pretty early on in the book that the characters didn't feel like the same people as they were in the first book, because Shorefall is the sequel to Foundryside, which I absolutely loved. Foundryside, like it was one of my favorite reads of last year, but I felt like the characters in Shorefall didn't feel like the same characters from Foundryside. And then I realized there was a time jump between the two books, and this wasn't explained fully until later on in the book. So I think that really threw me off. And then there was a few other things that kind of threw me off at the same time. I do think this book is fantastic, especially if you're a plot-driven reader. Like, this book does not stop. The plot is constant. And because of that, and the fact that it's set in such an interesting world, and it brings up some really like mind-bendy concepts that I really enjoy, I do think this book is really fantastic. There were just other aspects of this book that kind of threw me off a little bit. So because of that, even though I felt like this could have easily been a 5-star book for me, I ended up giving it 4.25 stars. So the next book I'd like to talk about is Writers and Lovers by Lily King. So this is another book that gripped me from the very beginning. And this is also literary fiction. I think there's something about the way literary fiction authors write that I find very gripping, especially since they're very character focused. And this is about a main character who is in very serious debt, and she's struggling to live a creative life because she wants to be a writer. And there's also kind of a love triangle in here, but it's like not about the love triangle. It's very much about the emotional journey, which I enjoyed that aspect of it. I do think the ending, I felt like it was going somewhere like really intense and emotional, and then it just kind of went the other way, and I was just kind of like, what? So like, while I enjoyed like the first 3/4 of this book immensely and was like so ready to give this 5 stars, the ending kind of ruined it for me, even though like it's not like that standout of an ending. Like, it's a normal ending, but I think that's what ruined it for me because I felt like it could have been great and then it just wasn't. So I ended up giving this one a 4.25 stars. So the next book that I'd like to talk about is The Stand by Stephen King. So this book is arguably a masterpiece. It is so raw and real. For those of you who don't know what this is about a super flu that basically changes the world as we know it. It's a post-apocalyptic novel. So like literally so many people die in this book. And I feel like I have to say that right off the bat because I don't recommend reading it right now. Like, I picked it up because I was just like, coronavirus is a thing right now. There's a pandemic going on. I've been meaning to read The Stand. It sounds like a good time to read it because I can relate to it. You don't want to relate to this book. Just trust me. It makes you so anxious because the way Stephen King writes, he writes so realistically, especially in the very beginning, because he's like depicting how the virus is spreading, and the way he depicts it, it was just kind of like, and this person goes over here and they sneeze and they pass it on to these 3 people, and this matronal lady goes to her bridge club and she passes on to all of her bridge club members. And it was just like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna go outside ever again sort of feeling while I was reading this book. After it it moves on in the very beginning from this is how the virus spreads to this is how the virus kills people, it starts to get really scary. Like, this book is horrifying at times. And I think that's why I rated it lower, like, because I wasn't enjoying it, even though it is arguably brilliant, but I wasn't enjoying it because it terrified me and made me extremely anxious. But I think in the long run, I'm going to look back on this and I'm going to absolutely love it. I just can't love it right now. So I ended up giving it 4.25 stars. I have a feeling that's gonna change in the long run, even though it's such a chunker of the book and it terrified me so much while I was reading it, I could not stop because it's so well written and it keeps you kind of like on the edge of your seat, but it's terrifying. So the next book I'd like to talk about is Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. I finally understand why people love Vonnegut so much because this book was crazy good. Like, this is the Time War sort of book that I was looking for this month, and it was so well done. This is another author that I feel like writes really realistic fiction, and you can tell that it is based off of his true experiences. It is very well done, and it's mind-bendy, and I loved every second of it. This is definitely a book that I'm gonna have to reread at some point in the future because I feel like there was just a lot going on here that I didn't fully understand. Because of that, I ended up downrating it a little bit, but it's one of the few books that I really think this month is absolutely brilliant and highly recommend anyone reading this. I ended up giving it 4.25 stars, but I think this is another one of those books where, like, in the future, in the long term, I might end up like really loving this book even more so than I do now. So the next book that I'd like to talk about is The Two Lives of Lydia Bird by Josie Silvers. So this is a contemporary romance novel, sort of, because it's supposed to be a contemporary romance novel, but there's a lot more going on to this, I feel like, because this is about a character who loses her husband, like, later on when she starts taking these sleeping pills. When she takes the pills, she lives another life in which her husband is alive. So when she's asleep, her husband is alive and she's living that life that would have happened if her husband had lived. And when she's awake, her husband is dead and she's in our world, like how it normally would be. And it is incredibly interesting how her two different lives kind of coincide and how they don't coincide, and like the characters that she meets and interacts with on the two different lives and how they're different in each of those lives. And also, it is very much about her emotional journey of grieving for her husband that is now dead. I found this book incredibly fast-paced. It drew me in from the very first second, and I could not stop reading it. Like, I read this book from cover to cover in maybe 48 hours at most, and I absolutely loved every second of this book, and I definitely want to read more by this author because I feel like her writing is just so compelling, and I'm really excited to see what more she has. I also really love this book because it has some really great romance in it, and it worked for me in a way that a lot of other romances just don't. I really love this book, and I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. So the next book that I'd like to talk about is Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. This is the sequel to Six of Crows. Obviously, everyone knows what this book is about. It did not disappoint for me. I absolutely loved it. It is one of those slower YA reads, and I think, like, honestly, like, some of the themes that this book explores, I feel like doesn't really fall into YA anymore. I feel like it's a little bit more of a new adult feel to it. I loved every second of this book. I think there was some really great character growth in here. If you watch my reading vlogs while I was reading this, like, I kept like complaining about like Wyland and I think it was Jesper, but like I still love them. I just didn't love them as much as some of the other characters. So like when their story arcs came to a head, I absolutely loved it, and I was so for every little thing that was happening. While I was reading it, I was just kind of like, let's get to the next chapter so I can get to Matthias, or so I can get to Kaz or Inej, because there's like so many things going on. And I felt like in this one, there was a little bit less flashbacks, except for in those characters that I mentioned. I don't like the flashback style, which is the only reason I didn't give this book 5 stars, or even Six of Crows, because I feel like this series could easily be a 5-star series, but I was really annoyed by the stylistic choice of doing flashbacks. I felt like there was just so much in those flashbacks. I would have just rather started the book from the beginning of those flashbacks, you know what I mean? And just had a longer series. That's just me though. I know some people probably preferred the flashbacks, but I personally didn't like it. So because of that, I gave it 4.75 stars. But otherwise, this book was fantastic and I absolutely loved every second of it. Like, this is the character-driven YA fantasy that I want from like every series that I read. And lastly, my favorite book that I read in the month of April is The Test by Sylvia Neuval. This was a complete surprise to me. One, because it's the only 5-star book that I read in this month, other than the rereads that I had. I was almost to the point where I was just like, I'm not gonna have a 5-star book in April. Like, it's not gonna happen. And then this book came out of complete nowhere. I picked it up on a complete whim. I just needed something quick to like tide over some time that I was listening to the audiobook while I was doing something else. And like, I started this audiobook, I got like 1 chapter in and I was like, this is actually really good. I'm really enjoying this. And then like something happens and like I was hooked. Like, I did not stop reading. I loved every second of this book. So this book is set in the near future where there is a British citizenship test. And that's really all I want to tell you guys about this, because like, I kind of described this book as getting punched in the face, because that is kind of how it felt. And it was painful, but at the same time, I loved every second of it. It is a very plot-driven book, very plot-driven. But at the same time, there are like 3 or 4 characters that are introduced here that I feel like we got to know really well and got a lot of development out of, even in this little space. Like, Sylvia Neuval is an author that I need to read more of now. Like, I don't know how he did all of that in such a little book, but I loved every second of it, and I think he did an amazing job of writing this book. If you guys have any like recommendations of books by Sylvia Neuval that I need to read, let me know down in the comments, because I haven't read anything by this guy. From this one book, he could potentially be one of my favorite authors, because I absolutely loved it and I ended up giving it 5 stars. So I had a pretty interesting reading month in the month of April. If you guys have read any of these books, let me know down in the comments, because I would love to discuss with you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. I post videos every Monday, Thursday, and Saturday. I also post bonus videos. If you want to be notified as soon as I upload, you can click that little bell icon. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up to support my channel. All social media links are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.